it true that he was fairly intense in the ring?
Oh yeah, he was wound pretty tight, man. Rick was dangerous.
Is that why Hogan never wrestled him?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Rick Rude was so dangerous that even Hulk Hogan refused to wrestle him, and the Road Warriors called him the toughest man they ever knew. He had the perfect body, the perfect career, the perfect life, and then something happened, a dark secret within WWE that ended it all. The man they called Ravishing Richard Irwin Rude was not supposed to die at 40, the man who made millions of wrestling. Fans hate him through sheer charisma and athletic excellence was found unconscious on his bedroom floor in Alpharetta, Georgia, on April 20th, 1999, and within hours, the wrestling world lost one of its greatest heels. But what actually happened to Ravishing Rick Rude? The official story says accidental overdose, yet whispers from those who knew him tell a far more disturbing tale. To understand how Rick Rude died, we first need to understand who he was and the men who shaped him into the competitor who would eventually become a WWE Hall of Famer. He came from Robbinsdale, Minnesota, a working-class suburb of Minneapolis that produced an extraordinary number of professional wrestlers, including the Road Warriors, Kurt Hennig, Barry Darko, and John Nord. And Rick Rude was right there with them.
We used to work at a bar called Grandma B's in northeast Minneapolis in Minnesota. And it was myself, Rick Rude, both the Road Warriors, and then there was a few other guys after that. We all worked at that bar. And we were all powerlifting and training and, in good shape and everything. And we used to throw guys out the front door.
These weren't just bouncers playing tough. They were real athletes training for professional careers. And the question of who was the toughest among this elite group came up again and again in interviews over the years. The fearlessness that made Rude effective as a bouncer would define his entire career. And unlike many wrestlers who projected toughness as part of their character, Rude's reputation for being dangerous was completely real.
All of us other guys, we might have been tougher, I don't know, but I wasn't a fighter, Animal wasn't a fighter, but if somebody wanted to fight you, you fought.
Right.
But Rick was a different kind of a guy. He was almost like a pit bull, The nicest guy, he would do anything for you. But boy, you crossed him, he'd be the first one to throw the punch and he'd do everything.
These weren't just bouncers playing tough. They were real athletes training for professional careers, and the question of who was the toughest among this elite group came up again and again in interviews over the years. The fearlessness that made Rude effective as a bouncer would define his entire career. And unlike many wrestlers who projected toughness as part of their character, Rude's reputation for being dangerous was completely real.
Is it true that he was fairly intense in the ring?
Oh yeah, he was wound pretty tight, man. Rick was dangerous.
Is that why Hogan never wrestled him?
Yeah, I'm sure.
That single admission explains everything about Rick Rude's place in the wrestling hierarchy. Hulk Hogan was the biggest star in professional wrestling during the late 1980s, and he wrestled everyone who mattered. Yet he never faced Rick Rude in any meaningful capacity because Rude was simply too dangerous. When a wrestler earns a reputation that keeps him away from the top champion, that reputation is real. But beneath that intimidating exterior was someone very different from the character he portrayed on television. The Ravishing Rick Rude gimmick cast him an arrogant ladies' man who mocked male audience members while their wives and girlfriends swooned, often stripping his robe to reveal custom airbrush tights featuring the face of whatever woman he was pursuing in the storyline. The character was designed to generate hatred, and it worked better than almost any heel persona in wrestling history. The irony is that Rick Rude, the person, was nothing like Rick Rude, the character. Colleagues universally described him as loyal, protective, and genuinely kind to friends. Bret Hart specifically credited Rude with watching his back during the tumultuous period after the Montreal Screwjob. When Hart was navigating his exit from WWF in an industry notorious for backstabbing and self-interest, Rude was someone you could trust completely. The respect he commanded among peers was extraordinary. He was considered one of the best workers in professional wrestling, someone who could tell a story in the ring, protect his opponents, and still look like a legitimate threat. That combination of genuine toughness and professional excellence made him invaluable. His creativity was just as remarkable, constantly pitching ideas to bookers and promoters, some conventional, some decidedly unconventional. One adult-oriented storyline he proposed never happened, because professional wrestling in the 1980s and early 1990s was still marketed to families. But it showed he was always thinking about how to generate reactions. push boundaries, and make audiences remember him long after the show ended. His relationships with fellow wrestlers were equally memorable, though he had habits that could annoy colleagues, like never returning borrowed music. Yet the affection in their voices was unmistakable. They weren't just co-workers sharing road stories. They were brothers mourning someone they genuinely loved. But all of this made what happened next even more devastating. Because Rick Rude's career didn't end through retirement, it ended in Japan on a spring night in 1994 due to a freak accident that destroyed everything he had built. On May 1st, 1994, in Fukuoka, Japan, at WCW Spring Stampede, Rude was defending the WCW International World Heavyweight Championship against Sting in what should have been another night of professional excellence. The match went 30 minutes to a time limit draw, but the damage was done before the bell rang. Late in the match, Sting attempted a diving maneuver from the top rope while Rude was positioned on a steel chair. The timing was off, the impact was wrong, and Rick Rude's cervical spine paid the price. With herniated discs at C4-C5 and C5-C6 compressing his spinal cord. Rick Rude described feeling an immediate electric shock down both arms and an instant loss of strength. And he was stretchered out of the arena and flown back to the United States that same night. Doctors initially warned he might never walk again without surgery. The anterior cervical fusion procedure saved his mobility, but left him with permanent nerve damage and chronic pain. WCW stripped him of the international title in June 1994 and officially retired him from in-ring competition, ending the career of one of wrestling's best heels at just 35, or so everyone thought. The injuries changed Rick Rude, but they didn't diminish his intensity. Stories of backstage confrontations continued to surface, especially involving wrestlers who didn't meet his standards of professionalism in the ring. Because the code among wrestlers from Robbinsdale was clear: protect your opponent in the ring. But if someone hurts you carelessly, settle it in the back. And Rick lived by that code his entire career. Rude refused to disappear, transitioning to managing and commentary work, keeping his presence in the industry even as his body failed him. Then in 1997, he pulled off something no wrestler had ever done before or since. After the Montreal Screwjob, the controversial finish to Bret Hart versus Shawn Michaels at Survivor Series, Rude walked out of WWF in protest and immediately contacted WCW about appearing on their programming, creating an unprecedented opportunity. On November 17, 1997, Monday Night Raw was pre-taped while Monday Nitro aired live. Rude appeared on Raw clean-shaven, wearing DX gear alongside Shawn Michaels and Triple H, and then 1 hour later on Live Nitro, he appeared with a full beard in a suit, officially rejoining the NWO. The same performer on both flagship shows in a single night. Viewers watching both channels simultaneously couldn't believe it. Eric Bischoff had specifically instructed Rude to shave for Raw and grow the beard back for Nitro, making the visual difference unmistakable. And the stunt became the most famous moment of the Monday Night Wars, a middle finger to WWF, showing just how chaotic the wrestling industry had become. Most fans didn't know Rude was still collecting WWF paychecks throughout this period because his Lloyd's of London disability insurance policy paid him long as he never took a bump. That restriction explains why Rude spent 5 weeks in ECW during October and November 1997 as a color commentator and special enforcer, never wrestling, always protected, with Paul Heyman giving him full creative freedom and cash under the table, while WWF continued sending checks. A perfect hustle by someone who understood exactly how to work the system. Yet the chronic pain never stopped. The 1994 injuries required constant management with medication, painkillers, muscle relaxants, and sleep aids. And the wrestling lifestyle had already introduced Rude to pharmaceutical solutions, which now became necessities rather than choices.
Pretty salty guys, because him and Heyman and all those guys and one of those Road Warriors come from up there, so they all had this little high school rivalry. And they're all pretty little tough little cookies, especially Rude. Rude was a kind of a, kind of salty kind of guy.
The saltiness masked something deeper. Multiple colleagues noted that despite his physical perfection and confident on-screen persona, Rick Rude struggled with self-consciousness and depression. Because the man whose entire character was built around supreme confidence was privately wrestling with demons that no audience...
Rude had, I think, a little bit of a depression problem. And for the way he looked, he was always ripped up and looked good. He actually had a little bit of a self-conscious issue. You know what I mean? I mean, he always was wondering how he looked and how he was.
This psychological vulnerability combined with a physical dependence on medication created a dangerous situation for Rick Rude. By late 1998, WCW quietly released him from his contract, as his neck and back issues had made him unreliable even for non-wrestling roles. But instead of accepting retirement, Rude began secretly training for a comeback, working out at local gyms in Alpharetta, Georgia, pushing his damaged body toward one final return to the ring. Colleagues who saw him during this period said he looked the best he had in years benching heavy, doing cardio. Planning his return for late 1999 or early 2000, after 5 years away from active competition, Rick Rude was coming back and then he died. The impact of his death reverberated throughout the wrestling industry. Jim Ross announced on Raw that Rick Rude had passed away from heart failure at 40, offering condolences to the Rude family. Though the brevity of the announcement belied how deeply his colleagues were affected, Shawn Michaels described Rude as the coolest person on the planet, saying DX lost a huge part of what made them special when he died. Triple H called him the blueprint for everything cool in the business and said his death was a gut punch. Sting revealed they had been planning one more run together right before Rude passed, and Paul Heyman declared that during his 5-week ECW stint, Rick Rude was the single coolest human being he ever booked. Kurt Hennig, who would tragically die just 4 years later, revealed he had spoken to Rude only 2 days before his death. Rude had sounded great, excited about his comeback, pumped to return to the ring, with no indication that anything was wrong. The morning of April 20th, 1999, started like any other. Rick Rude trained at a local gym in Alpharetta with his protege, Mike Bell, looking and feeling the best he had in years. The workout was intense, heavy bench presses and cardio, the kind of training that suggested a man preparing for something big. After 5 years away from active competition, he was planning a return to the ring in late 1999 or early 2000, one more run to prove he was still ravishing. That afternoon, he came home, told his wife Michelle he felt wiped out from the workout, and went upstairs to lie down for a nap. The kind of exhaustion that comes from pushing a damaged body beyond its limits. Around 3:30 p.m., Michelle found him unconscious on the bedroom floor. He had vomited and wasn't breathing. Empty prescription bottles, Valium, GHB, and other medications that had become as essential to his daily life as food and water lay on the nightstand. The chronic pain from his 1994 neck injury never stopped, and the medications that dulled that pain had become a permanent fixture in his life. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found him in full cardiac arrest, working frantically to restart his heart twice with defibrillation in the ambulance. There was hope. There always was hope with Rick Rude, a man who had survived things that would have ended lesser careers and lives. At North Fulton Regional Hospital in Roswell, Georgia, doctors briefly got a pulse back, and for a moment, it seemed like he might cheat death once more. Then a second cardiac arrest occurred at approximately 5:15 p.m., this one irreversible. At 5:37 p.m., Richard Irwin Rude was pronounced dead at 40 years, 4 months, and 13 days old. The official cause of death was congestive heart failure triggered by an overdose of mixed prescription medications, and the Fulton County coroner ruled it accidental. Case closed. Another wrestler had died too young from the lifestyle that made him famous. The wrestling world had seen deaths before and would see them again. But those who knew Rick Rude tell a very different story, one involving medical complications, psychological breakdown, and circumstances far more disturbing than a simple accidental overdose. The official narrative is clean. The truth is anything but. Wrestling legend Ken Patera shared details in multiple interviews painting a picture of a man whose body had betrayed him the most devastating way possible. According to Patera, who heard the story directly from Jim Neihart, one of Rude's closest friends, Rick had been dealing with intimate dysfunction as a side effect of years of steroid use. The very substances that had sculpted his perfect physique were destroying him from the inside. In an attempt to address the problem, Rude allegedly injected medication directly into a sensitive area, a practice not uncommon among men facing similar issues, but with substantial risks. For Rick, those risks materialized in the worst possible way, resulting in a severe infection that spread rapidly and required immediate medical attention. The graphic nature of what happened next explains why this story rarely appears in official histories or mainstream wrestling documentaries. Multiple sources close to Rude confirmed that the infection was initially misdiagnosed, with doctors reportedly suspecting something far more serious, possibly cancer, and by the time the actual problem was identified, emergency surgery was the only option. The surgery saved his life, but took something that, for Rick, may have been worse than death itself. Emergency procedures required removal of affected tissue, and for a man whose entire public identity was built around physical perfection and attractiveness, who had made millions gyrating his hips while women screamed and men seethed with jealousy, this loss was psychologically catastrophic. The ravishing Rick Rude character was built on masculine perfection, the airbrush tights, the striptease entrance, the way he made every woman in the audience feel he was looking directly at her, and that physical confidence was now gone. The man who had everything that made him ravishing had lost the one thing he could not replace. Multiple wrestlers have confirmed hearing about a prior attempt on his own life before April 20th, 1999, and if true, this changes everything about how we understand his death. The official classification of accidental overdose becomes questionable when viewed against the backdrop of a man who had already tried once to end his suffering. The combination of medications found in his system, GHB and Valium specifically, is potentially fatal even in moderate amounts. GHB, known among wrestlers in the 1990s as the goodnight kiss, induced deep restorative sleep that helped damaged bodies recover from nightly punishment. But it had an extremely narrow therapeutic window. The difference between a dose that helped you sleep and a dose that stopped your breathing was measured in milliliters. And mix it with any other depressant, alcohol, Valium, painkillers, and the margin for error disappeared entirely. Rick knew this. Every wrestler who used GHB knew this. The toxicology report confirmed multiple substances, though exact combinations and quantities were redacted from public documents. What is clear is that Rick had been managing chronic pain for 5 years since his career-ending injury. The herniated discs, nerve damage, constant stiffness, and agony never went away. The medications that made life bearable also made it fragile, and every day was a balancing act between enough medication to function and too much to survive. Those who knew him best remain divided. Some believe it was purely accidental. A man recovering from a brutal workout who miscalculated his medication dosage after pushing his body too hard, needing more help sleeping than usual after an intense training session that morning. Perhaps the GHB interacted with the Valium in ways Rick didn't anticipate. Or perhaps it was just tragic bad luck, the kind of accident that claims lives every day. Others believe the medical complications he suffered in the months before his death destroyed his will to live. Colleagues noted that despite his confident on-screen persona, Rick Rude struggled with self-consciousness and depression throughout his life, always worrying about how he looked and whether he measured up to the image he projected. The surgery that saved his life may have taken something he considered essential to his identity, leaving him unable to see a reason to continue. Still, others suggest the truth lies somewhere in between, a man who didn't actively try to end his life, but also didn't particularly care if his choices proved fatal. This theory posits that Rick knew the risks of mixing medications, the dangers of GHB, and that every night he went to sleep there was a chance he wouldn't wake up. And he made peace with that possibility, not suicide in the traditional sense, but not quite an accident either. A man who stopped fighting to stay alive without ever making a conscious decision to die. Those closest to him cannot agree, and perhaps that's the point. Rick Rude kept his demons private. The man who performed in front of millions never let anyone see the battles he fought alone. What is certain is that the wrestling world lost one of its greatest performers far too soon. Jim Ross announced his death on Raw with brief condolences to the Rude family, but the brevity belied how deeply his colleagues were affected. Shawn Michaels called him the coolest person on the planet, saying DX lost a huge part of what made them special. While Triple H described him as the blueprint for everything cool in the business and called his death a gut punch, Sting revealed they had been planning one more run together just before Rude passed, and Kurt Hennig, who would die 4 years later, said he had spoken to Rick 2 days before his death and noticed nothing wrong. He sounded great, excited about the future, and ready to return. Bobby Heenan, who managed Rude during his greatest WWE run, called him the perfect heel because he was a better person than 99% of the babyfaces, capturing the fundamental tragedy of Rick Rude's life. A genuinely good man who played a genuinely